They will have their body pierced with between 1 and 600 needles. Some will have these large skewers that are pierced through their cheeks. Sometimes they can be so long and heavy that they have to bite down at them and hold them with both hands. Otherwise, they'll rip their face off.
That's anthropologist Dimitris Xygalatas. And what he's describing here might sound like a sadistic way to torment people.
But that's not even the most painful part. They will drag these enormous chariots through hooks that are attached to the back of their skin.
It is torturous, but it's also voluntary. People choose to do it. They want to take on the trial. It's a sacred Hindu ritual called the Thaipusam Kavadi.
We're really talking about a full day of self-imposed torture.
Okay, so wait. I'm the guy who asks for the extra shot of Novocaine at the dentist. For most of us, pain is something we try to avoid. So why would people seek it out? Religious communities all over the world have rites where people pierce and whip themselves, walk over hot coals, fast for days, or even put themselves on crosses. And this has been happening for centuries. On today's episode, we'll learn how these painful, grueling rituals can bind people together and create deep feelings of empathy. And how all of us, even if we're not enduring these painful rites, might still benefit from a little bit of suffering. I'm Dave DeSteno, and this is How God Works. Growing up in Greece, Dimitris remembers being intrigued early on by images of exotic rituals from cultures and times that seemed pretty far removed from his own.
You know, I grew up in an urban environment in a big city in Greece. And one of my favorite things as a child, once a month, I would go to the city center and I would buy the monthly issue of National Geographic. And I would see all of those flamboyant rituals, initiation ceremonies, in the Amazon when people will be bitten by bullet ants, or a place in the Middle East where they would slash their backs with razors. And they looked so exotic to me. I always had the sense that those were relics of the past. They were on their way to extinction. Until I realized that some of these very things were happening in my own country. I was in my early teens, I guess, when I saw this pilgrimage in the island of Tinos, where people crawl on their hands and knees up the hill to reach this sacred site, the Church of Virgin Mary. And when they reach their destination, they're all bloody and exhausted, and a lot of them faint. When they asked them, why do you do this, they didn't have a clear answer. So I immediately thought this was a very powerful and important question. Why do people engage in these actions?
So Dimitris began to look for other cultures around the world that were still practicing these extreme rituals, which is how he first encountered the Thaipusam Kavadi of Mauritius, which is actually centered around a sacred journey.
It's essentially a pilgrimage. It's a pilgrimage to the temple of Lord Murugan. But before actually they embark on this pilgrimage, people will build these structures called kavadi. That's what gives the ritual its name. Kavadi means burden, literally. And indeed, they're very heavy structures. They look like miniature shrines. They're decorated with the gods' icons and statues, and they have peacock feathers, and they have flowers. And these are made on a frame, and they will be carried on the shoulders for the entire duration of the pilgrimage. And that can be 5 hours, or it can be 10 hours, it can be the entire day. These are very heavy structures, so we have measured some of them. They can weigh up to about 100 pounds. And they will do this under the scorching midsummer tropical sun without drinking any water. And when they reach the temple, at least the temple that I studied in Mauritius, they have to climb 242 steps up the hill, carrying their burden before they can have all these piercings removed.
Wow. So to me, that raises two questions, and I think probably to most people. How and why? How do they persevere with that level of physical distress on their body? That is, do they feel the pain? Is there something that the body does to help them not feel the pain? And the second question is why? Not theologically, but what function does this serve?
So I've asked hundreds of people why they perform these rituals. And I think roughly we can categorize those ideas into 4 types. One is tradition. It's this idea that we do it because we do it, or we do it because our ancestors have done it. That's just what we do. Another category, which is related, this is because I'm devout. I'm doing it for religious reasons. Because Murugan wants me to do it, or because I believe A third category is experience. I'm doing it because of the way it makes me feel. Some people might fall into trance during those rituals. They might experience states of dissociation. Others might just enjoy the journey, not in the sense that this gives them pleasure, but in the sense that this is a meaningful sacrifice to them. The fourth reason was a very human, very everyday, mundane reason, is that usually people will make a vow. They'll get into this type of ritual on the basis of a promise to the deity, and usually they're asking for something in return.
Do they experience the pain while they're doing it?
It's not exactly what they feel in the moment, right? You can only ask them later. One very interesting thing is to see how they remember. And we have been able to compare that to actual physiological measurements. And we can see that the two are not always in accordance. So, for example, in the context of a fire walking ritual in Spain, when I asked people to quantify their levels of stress, they all insisted that they were as calm as ever during the fire walking ritual. Some of them challenged me to bet money. They said, I bet you 20 euros that I'll have a higher heart rate right now that you're doing the interview than when I was walking through fire. But of course, when we looked at the data, that was not so. Most of them had over 200 beats per minute, which means that they were on the verge of a heart attack.
So the body is clearly reacting to the stress it's under.
Yes. We also see it in the context of the cavity specifically. We used GSR monitors, which is a very common measure of stress. So what we see is that during that ritual, people's stress levels are orders of magnitude higher than anything they experience in their everyday lives.
But now, is it possible that when the body's under extreme stress, you may get an endorphin release that will blunt the brain's experience of this?
Absolutely. We actually published one paper. We call this paper the Firewalker's High, which was a pun on this phenomenon, the runner's high, because what we saw there in a different ritual in Mauritius that involved both walking on fire and walking on the edges of knives. And that was all after a very long, exhausting procession. And we saw that the more effort people put into this ritual, the more exhausted we would expect them to be. Actually, the less tired they felt, and the more euphoric afterwards. And this seems to be precisely this phenomenon that we call the runner's high. After a long period of exhaustion, there comes this kick of euphorians, endogenous euphorians, like endorphins, that will produce this experience.
People say they take part in painful rituals because it's tradition, or because God wants them to. But is it possible there's a deeper reason, a more social function they serve?
So now we're getting to the evolutionary type of the why question. So nobody says that we do this ritual in order to boost social cohesion. At the same time, they do say things like, having done this ritual, I now feel more connected to my peers. Once you're up there and you've been through this, you have bonded. Everybody's your brother after this, even if before the ritual they were your enemy. They talk about this feeling of oneness and togetherness. They say there are 3,000 people there, but we all feel like one.
Anna, see, that's an interesting point. So you're not saying it's just the individuals who are choosing to walk the coals. It's the whole body of observers as well. So while they may not feel they're part of the ritual, even by observing, they are part. Is that what you're suggesting?
Yes, and it is important to stress that when these rituals are performed, typically the entire community participates. They might participate in different roles. Not everybody has to walk on fire. Perhaps that's 20 or 30 or 50 individuals. But the 1,000 people who are watching, they too are part of this ritual. They're playing an active role.
Okay, quick clarification here. When Dimitris says active, he doesn't mean cheering people on. It's not like watching a baseball game. Spectators are affected on a much deeper level.
This firewalking ritual in a small village called San Pedro Manrique in Spain, a village of 600 people. And they have built this amphitheater that can host 3,000 spectators, and they only use it once a year to host this firewalking ritual. It's clearly the biggest event in the area. When I asked people, everybody said it's the most important event in their lives. We used heart rate monitors to measure the physiological reactions during this ritual. And the idea is that if those anthropological theories are correct, then we should expect to see that the people's emotional reactions come in alignment during this ritual, no matter what they're doing.
And we also feel more connected. We've talked previously in the show about motor synchrony, which happens in a lot of rituals. If we move together, sing together, chant together in time, we feel closer. But what you're suggesting is it's not just the motions we do, but it even happens on a physiological level.
Exactly. People who are not engaged actively in those rituals but are participating as spectators will we see this sort of empathic radiation of the effects of those rituals. And that's exactly what we're seeing. So we see that people's heart rates were synchronized to really an astonishing degree.
So as the firewalkers' heart rate spiked, so did the audience's, even though they were sitting comfortably in their seats. But the pattern wasn't the same for everyone.
So those who were closest to the firewalkers, their family, their best friends, they had the greatest synchrony. Members of the community who were not that close to them followed. And of course, those outsiders who were just there as tourists, they had no synchrony with them at all.
So just to be clear about this, what's going on is there's someone in the center of the amphitheater who will be traversing these coals. And how hot are the coals?
Those coals are hot enough to melt aluminum. So we measured them on over 1,200 degrees Fahrenheit.
Okay. And so as that person walks across the coals, you can chart their heart rate, changes in their heart rate by the sensors they're wearing. And I assume their heart rates increase when they're doing this?
Oh, yes. Most people have over 200 beats per minute. Some of them reach levels that I never thought were possible.
So what does that do? Like, how does that change people? What's their experience of it before and after?
So when we go through these often traumatic moments with each other, that is one of the most powerful bonding experience that we can get as human beings. And this is because typically we expect that we go through these very emotional events. If you think about it, the most emotional events in your life, whether it's a joy like a wedding or tragedy like a loss, you would experience those with your close relatives, with your core family, with your best friends. So those rituals, in a sense, spare you from having to go through these traumatic moments in order to feel the bonding. They set up the situation in such a way that you actually experience that same level of shared arousal, and that has the same kind of bonding effects.
Wow. I never thought of it that way, but it's almost like, right, one person is carrying the load for others.
Yes.
To have this experience.
And this is why I tend to refer to these kinds of rituals as social technologies. And they are used not just by religions, but they're used across a wide variety of contexts. Things like military groups and fraternities and gangs and even corporate team building. So the idea is that you put people through this highly emotional experience in advance. You don't wait for something like warfare to happen, because in the context of, in the battlefield, people will be bonded together. And they will be bonded precisely because they have experienced this shared extreme arousal. But you can do this in a safer space. You don't have to send them to the battlefield in order to have these bonding effects. So you can do this in advance in the context of a ritual where everything is more controlled.
That is really interesting. I never thought of it in this realm, because typically when you see this, it's, the band of brothers who are bonded by facing battle together. But what your work is actually suggesting is that anybody who is observing it is getting the same benefit, which to me is an astounding social technology. So how does it change how they treat each other after? So, we do this firewalking ritual at the end. We're saying we're all brothers and sisters. This is wonderful. Do people become more pro-social toward each other, more ethical, more willing to sacrifice?
So this is the obvious next question, because that is the question we're asking to begin with. And of course, we measured physiological reactions, we measured emotional reactions, but the really important question is that how does this affect behavior? In the context of the Kavadi ritual, we have both the active performers, several hundreds of people who will have their body pierced with needles, and they carry the Kavadis, but also many hundreds of people who are just walking alongside them. These are typically their friends and family or other members of the community. They walk the same procession, but they don't carry any burden. They don't have any piercing. They're not walking barefooted on the burning asphalt, and so on and so forth. Immediately after they had done one of those rituals, what we did is that we invited people to come into a room, both performers and the spectators. And those are all related spectators. Those are members of the same community. And ask them whether they would like to contribute to this charity. And what we're finding there is that people become much more prosocial after the Taipusam Kavadi. So those people gave over 3 times more than what the people in the control group gave. And we see that there is essentially no difference in the donations of these two groups. So taking part in this ritual in any role at all boosted generosity for everyone.
So even though only a few people walk the coals or pierce their skin, the whole group becomes the better for it. They all feel closer. They all treat each other better. You might be tempted to say, to quote Mr. Spock, that the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few. But the beauty here is that that's not really true. Yes, some people are accepting stress for the good of all, but in the end, they don't really experience the pain to the full degree. They're happy for the sacrifice, which in some ways suggests it might not be a sacrifice at all. And that raises a slightly different question. Do the people who actually walk the coals or pierce their skin get any individual benefits from it?
Yes, and that's a very important part of the story, because we can talk about the group benefits, but in order for these behaviors to become attractive to individuals, they have to provide some direct benefits to them. And indeed, we're finding that they do. So ritual in general has been related to reducing anxiety. And even in the context of these extreme rituals, we're actually finding benefits in terms of people's quality of life. And we see that the more intense the participation in those rituals, so the more needles people put in their bodies, and the higher the recordings of their electrodermal activity were during the ritual, the greater the effects that they experience a month later in terms of their subjective well-being and quality of life.
Public rituals of suffering can bring people together, but not all suffering needs to be public to have powerful spiritual effects. Sometimes people choose it quietly in private devotion, other times through prayer and contemplation to try to make sense of the suffering they've been handed. But for these rituals to have persisted over centuries, there must be some personal benefit too, some reason why struggle makes sense. To help answer that question, I turned to my friend, former Yale professor Paul Bloom, who has written about pleasure, but most recently explored pain and suffering in his new book, The Sweet Spot. Hi, Paul. Thanks for joining us today.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Of course, always a pleasure. I want to start off by asking something that kind of I find interesting, but I think it's right up your alley, which is, in most ways, humans are built for pleasure, right? If you ask most people what constitutes the good life, they'd say things like vacations, good food and drink, enjoying times with family and friends. I don't think many would say struggle, or especially not pain. Yet, we do see people not only face difficulty and endure difficulty, but even choose it at times. And so my question to you, Paul, is why? What am I missing about the psychology here?
I've been interested over the last few years in exactly that puzzle. Why do we seek out pain and suffering and difficulty? Not just as an instrument to get something. You know, you wake up in the middle of the night to feed the baby, you take a long walk to pick up the mail. But why do we seek it for its own sake? And I think it's a question with many answers. I think suffering and pain can be a source of pleasure in some cases. Think about hot baths and saunas and horror movies and sadomasochistic sex and that sort of thing. But it can also suggest that we don't just want pleasure. And I think suffering and pain can help us with other motivations and appetites we have, including maybe transcendence, meaning, purpose. So one answer to your question is we seek suffering because it's part and parcel of what we see as a meaningful life.
So is there an easy way to differentiate when it is something that is chosen for its masochistic and thus pleasurable purposes versus when it provides more meaning?
I think we could identify things on the extreme. So take on the one hand, you have a sprained ankle and you got to put some weight on it, or you enter a really hot bath. You just do it for immediate sensation, some degree of control and mastery, maybe some contrast with the pleasure of relieving the pain. So that's on the one extreme. On the other extreme, there are sort of lifelong pursuits like raising children, some religious practices and devotions, trying to make the world a better place that you might say, this is really hard work. It kind of sucks. I know you just completed a book. And there's the example of chosen suffering, pain, anxiety, deprivation. It's much more fun to be on Twitter, but yet you do it. And then there's sort of things in between, like some degree of focused attention.
So I guess the question then is, how does suffering, struggle, pain, supply meaning, does it do it in the moment, or is it kind of a justification afterward that we ascribe to it?
Well, both. There's two kinds of suffering. We could split it up into chosen suffering and unchosen suffering. And even chosen suffering isn't necessarily a choice to suffer. Suppose I decide to run a marathon and I have to train for it. I'm not hoping for blisters. I'm not hoping for disappointment and exhaustion and so on. But at the same time, if I knew that it was going to be easy, what would be the point? The fact this is difficult is part of what makes it meaningful. So that's chosen suffering. Unchosen suffering is more complicated when bad stuff happens to us, being assaulted, the death of somebody we love, a global pandemic. And then I think we try to supply meaning after the fact. And one of the things religion does, I think, is provide us with a framework through which to understand terrible things that happen to us.
And so why does giving it meaning make it seem less? Does it actually diminish our memory for the intensity of the suffering that we had? Or does it just make it seem that the world is a just and safe place and there was a reason for that suffering?
Yeah, I think it suggests there's a reason, and our suffering might serve a purpose. If from a certain framework, a very secular framework, which I have actually myself personally, if something bad happens to me, well, that's just bad things happen. That's all there is to say about it. And I just was unlucky. But from another framework, something bad happens to me, I could think it's God's will. It's to teach me a lesson. It happened for a reason, as the phrase goes. Maybe it's going to bring me closer to God. C.S. Lewis says, when we're happy, we just hear God's whisper, but when we suffer, he shouts at us. And you have these frameworks, and it gives it meaning. And I could see, from a distance, that this could be quite reassuring.
You can think about the ways to pursue growth, and spiritual growth being one of them, as happening in two ways within a religious context. One is, I am going to pray, I'm going to read the Bible, the Torah, whatever my sacred text might be, and contemplate those things and develop myself spiritually. Or I can add this element of struggle and discomfort, again, done mostly in private. And what that suggests to me is you're right. Even when we take the public out, even when we take the signaling value out, even when we take the public bonding, pro-social nature of forming a band of brothers or sisters or mixed company out, it is fulfilling some psychological need.
And you can imagine two opposing stories. One of them very critical, the other less so. The critical one sees this as a version of pathology. So it subsumes the devout Christians who scar themselves and hurt themselves in the same category as adolescents who cut themselves. And, maybe it's a cry for help. Maybe it's self-punishment, where you think you're bad. We're moral creatures. Part of being a moral creature is you punish the bad. And often we turn that on ourselves. We think we're bad people and we want to hurt ourselves. That's the sort of less charitable explanation. A more charitable explanation is it's an act of devotion to God. There's a song from the Proclaimers, I Would Walk 500 Miles, and it's a love song. And it's, what I would do for you, my love. And, I would do all of these things. And the impulse is perfectly understandable. When we love somebody, want to show our devotion, we will do a lot. Otherwise, it's meaningless. And you can imagine that directed not towards the person, but towards God. And so sacrifices and giving us and suffering could be part of what's seen as an act of fidelity in a devoted relationship with any care at all to what other people think and what other people see. There's also one other thing, which is, I always quote C.S. Lewis here, and he's talking about fasting. And he makes a really nice distinction. He says, somebody who's run out of food because he can't afford food, or even worse, has his food taken away from him, so he's hungry. That's just awful. Not much to be said about it. But someone who chooses not to eat, who fasts, this paradigmatic religious example of chosen suffering, who fasts, in some ways exercising his control and has a sense of mastery. Now, what's interesting here is C.S. Lewis actually disapproves of it. it gets kind of complicated. He says, well, who are you? Why are you so busy flexing your willpower muscles, getting all proud of yourself? Maybe some humility is due. But whether he approves or not, I think that's in part an answer to your question, which is to do chosen suffering, to engage in religious practice, to sacrifice day after day after day, can't help but leave you with the feeling that you have power. You are in control of your destiny.
That raises an interesting point, which is ritual acts of devotion, acts of worship can function at multiple levels. That is, at a very conscious, intentional level, you could be doing this to show your devotion to a higher power. But in another level, giving you that sense of increased feelings of control or mastery, even if they're not consciously acknowledged, can be very rewarding and very empowering in a good way, to make you feel like you can then exert more, hopefully, good influence on this world.
Yeah, and it may even be good for you. There's a lot of debate right now in psychology about the metaphor of willpower as a muscle. And there's a lot of controversy back and forth. But if there's any truth to it, then certainly going through as a child religious rituals. For me, I spent some time in an ultra-Orthodox Lubavitch synagogue, and there's just a lot of sitting there, a lot of sitting and doing nothing, and just a lot of deprivation. And it's not a particularly fun time. And you might imagine that getting good at that sort of thing better equips you in life to undergo sacrifices later on. You know what it's like to feel like getting up after 4 hours, but you can't. You know what it's like to see a food you'd really want to eat and you can never eat it. There's a few studies looking at the extent to which the degree of suffering you've had in your life corresponds to certain virtues you might have. So one research program finds that people who basically came through life unscathed, had very little suffering, show surprisingly low pain tolerance and tend to kind of freak out at the idea of pain. And this, I think, is sort of good, concrete laboratory evidence that some amount of suffering, maybe not too much, but some amount, does in some way make you a better person.
Does suffering make you a better person? The answer is mostly yes. I say mostly because there are certain types of suffering that can shatter us. Some traumas are too much for any one person to bear, and it's those cases that require professional psychological help. But from other types of suffering, whether it befalls us or we choose it ourselves, there can be growth. Public rituals of pain and challenge can bind us to one another in safer ways than battles, plagues, and disasters do. But adversity of any type can also nudge us toward virtue. In my own work with the psychologist Daniel Lim, we asked people to report whether they experienced poverty, natural disaster, violence, or early loss of loved ones. And what we found is that these experiences usually lead people toward doing God's work, at least in the metaphorical sense of that term. When we show them others in pain, they feel more compassion for them. When we offer them the chance to donate money to help victims of natural disasters, they donate more. We also ran an experiment where we had a guy in the lab say he's feeling too sick to keep working on a project. The people who had suffered in life were much more likely to offer to take on his share of the work and relieve him of the burden. In all these cases, those who have faced pain or adversity didn't feel weak or broken by it. They felt empowered. If you find a way to understand or embrace it, rather than curse it, pain can sometimes bring meaning, purpose, and, well, good. That doesn't necessarily mean you should seek it, but understanding how and why it can lead to growth can help demystify why some people might. Or, in the unfortunate case it comes knocking at your door, help you to find strength in it. That's it for Season 1 of How God Works. We'll be back with Season 2 in February to explore how spiritual practices help us walk the road of life. We'll look at how certain rituals help new parents bond with children, how they help our little ones build character and then transition to adulthood, how they help us strengthen our marriages, deal with the challenges and regrets of midlife, and find peace in the face of grief and even our own impending deaths. And we want to hear from you. Send us an email at howgodworks@prx.org That's HOWGODWORKS@prx.org for the chance to have your question or story featured on the show. And in the meantime, check your feed for a special How God Works bonus episode to help you stick to your resolutions just when science says you, me, and pretty much everyone starts to lose our resolve. How God Works is hosted and written by me, Dave DeSteno. Our senior producer is Josie Holtzman of Future Projects. Associate producer is Sophie Eisenberg. Our executive producer is Genevieve Sponsler. Music and post-production mix and master by Merritt Jacob. The executive producer of PRX Productions is Jocelyn Gonzalez. This podcast was also made possible with support from the John Templeton Foundation. If you want to learn more, you can head to my website, www.davedesteno.com.